Dare to be true, dare to be true, and dare to be true. What do you mean, Elizabeth? Dare to be true? Are you suggesting we're not true? Not honest? What? Yes, Mashpee, I am suggesting that you're in denial. You are. Well, maybe not you personally, not individually, but collectively, your culture is. And that's a problem. I'm here to remind you that denial is not only an individual phenomenon, it's also, and far more forcefully, a collective one, a socially organized state of mind and being that depends on our ability to hold two truths or more as if they were one, and to erase the ones we don't want to see. To block things that challenge our sense of security and our certainty about how the world just is, and how we fatally interpret to mean how the world always has been and always will be. How do we incorporate those frightening ideas and problems, impending climate disaster, racist harm? Well, we usually ignore our good common sense and our very own senses and push away those ideas that don't fit into our dominant national narrative, and we return quickly to that pillow, that soft comfort of our status quo, just the way things are. And this explains how even the best of us can fail to acknowledge hard truths, even though we may be well-informed, even though we may see with our very own eyes. We can call this state being of one clear mind. It's a comfortable place to be, and it's also terribly dangerous. Like many of you, I suspect, I am not of one mind. I am always of two or more minds, and sometimes I feel it will be the death of me, the strain of holding this paradox. I think I'll feel this way until more of us are of two or more minds. Let me explain. That's me on South Cape Beach, just up the road, with puppies. And we can witness my two-mind state right here in this sweet summer photo, even with the puppies. I am a woman of Italian and Swedish descent. My family came here in the early 1900s. I am what we call white. How did I come to be on this land? Whose stories, whose lives were silenced, erased, for my image to be made in this place? I come to you this evening to talk about the gap between our country's stated ideals, equality, opportunity, justice, and the lived experience of those who were never meant to claim them. It's the very definition of preposterous, as are the stories that we tell and make up to cover. I come to you thinking about first what it means to stand on this ground, Mashpee, hallowed ground made sacred by the atrocities that happened here, that are rarely mentioned here, though their impacts are everywhere visible here, if only, to borrow from Amanda Gorman, we're brave enough to see it. I honor our First Nation, Wampanoag, Wampanoag, people of the First Light, presencing here, grounding here, to feel the charge of the earth and all its energies, to feel all who have walked here. I feel the call to truth from erasure and harm. Will you come with me here, now, tonight? Let's go together in the eye of our imagination to Coles Hill, Plymouth. Let's see the sea of Wampanoag people gathered to mark a national day of mourning, also known as Thanksgiving. Here's what Wampanoag people say about this holiday. Thanksgiving Day is a reminder of the genocide of millions of Native people, the theft of Native lands, and the erasure of Native cultures. I'm of two minds, Mashpee. I am of two minds, and the space between is toxic. On the one hand, a laundry list of human rights violations that the world has collectively called the very worst: genocide, rape, forced displacement, enslavement, cultural annihilation, and more. On the other, turkey and pie, football and long naps, and ironically, the kind of kitchen conversations that can crack a family in two when they find that they're not of one mind. I ruminate. How must it feel to my First Nations neighbors to witness Thanksgiving, a holiday defined precisely by the consumption that's defiled Indigenous land and life, to the point where the Great Turtle Island, the earth itself, is in extreme peril. Harm. What has always lived between these two American stories is all the unspeakable harm we now document with data that exposes gaps in the very stuff of life itself: health, mortality, wealth, education, residence, mobility, opportunity, well-being, prosperity. Harm directly descended from the power dynamics initiated on what we still call First Encounter Beach. Hard enough for many among us even to acknowledge that there's such a gap. But more than the gap itself, I'm asking you to think tonight about how our single-minded national determination to be of one clear mind, unencumbered by the painful complexities of our own history, has allowed us to all live with a gap that is utterly intolerable according to our own stated values and convictions. It's how even the most aware among us have swallowed a status quo built on repression and denial and injustice. If you're not of two minds, Mashpee, then you must be repressing something, pushing something away, denying something. Wait, Elizabeth, are you doing it again? Are you accusing us again? It's not just you I accuse, Mashpee. It's me too. It's all of us. Because we all breathe the air of our dominant culture, and we all internalize the toxic right along with the good. Think of it this way. First Nations people and Black people and trans people and women and all the others that we call other don't have the luxury of being of one mind, don't have the experience of having what's out there match and align with deeply held beliefs and ideas about how to be, even in one's body, don't have the luxury to have those two align. That beautiful coherence of identity that greases the wheel for so many in our dominant cultures, unthinkable for those whose histories and ways of life have been fractured by colonialism, by racism. If you're of one clear mind, then you've likely not had to adapt to a culture not your own, and you've likely absorbed the dominant narrative as the only one. Because what is colonialism but a 400-year exercise in European criminality? Settlers stealing, raping, intentionally spreading disease, and more. In fact, settler history from the Wampanoag perspective doesn't start in 1620. It starts before that in 1616, in a time known as the Great Dying, which we heard about in our earlier talk, when yellow fever and smallpox and other diseases brought by Europeans killed 90% of the indigenous population here. There's this law of nature, though, that we really can't ignore. A law that says what is repressed will return. What is repressed must manifest. And it can do so in very destructive ways if we don't intentionally surface it, metabolize it, witness it, and pass on from it. God forbid we contort ourselves like the woman in I Don't Want to Know About That by renowned Cape artist Jackie Reeves. Her brilliant take on the machinations of our collective denial after the murder of George Floyd, Say His Name. The distorted, undignified posture, a figure, a body, a woman made ugly and flailing by her unrighteous desire to push away what she doesn't want to know. And what of our human propensity to claim authority to decide what kinds of suffering are legitimate, are worthy of compassion and care, and which are not? Let me give an example. In the aftermath of a harmful incident involving a white student dressed in blackface at a campus Halloween party where I teach, we held a teach-in to help our community to understand why it was that this costume was so harmful to Black students who are trying to feel at home in this 4-year home away from home In the front row of the campus chapel where we were gathered, a woman of color, Jamie from New York, sat quietly crying. And I noticed that no one reached out to comfort her. And I asked that audience, if you saw Jamie on the street and she'd fallen and gotten hurt, would you pause to help her? Would you reach out to try to ease her pain? Would you believe her that she was in pain? And if you answer yes to that question, then why are you not reaching out to her right now? What is different? How did our compassion dry up so easily? Thing is, though, the truth will out. Mashpee, the truth will out. The very definition of trauma is repetition. Repetition, the return of the repressed. And not just any repetition, compulsive repetition. Meaning that the one doing the repeating is not even aware that they are doing it. And are we not living in a time of collective trauma? Have we not always been, though we're loath to admit it? Just know this, even if you try to pretend it isn't there, as my predominantly white campus community did with Jamie, the energy of harm does not go anywhere until it's deliberately broken into manageable chunks and processed together, dispersed. And then, the whoosh of light into our tunnels at that moment might just knock us down. Let's go back to the land, Cape Cod, this peninsula we call home. I don't have to tell this audience, I'm sure, but for the broader TED community, here in Upper Cape Cod, we suffer from seriously elevated cancer rates. I should know, I'm just one of the thousands who are surviving that statistic, and I'm representing for the many thousands more who are not. Let's think about cancer, Mashpee. What is cancer but a return of the repressed, of toxins and hazardous chemicals dumped into our water, ammunition buried in our soil, waste that we don't like to know about mustering into those clumps of dysfunctional cells, those tumors, those life sentences. I spent much of the early pandemic with a shadow group of humans all but living in my finished basement, with its separate entrance the only place that a group of recent college grads could congregate in the early days of the pandemic. They came together because they had just lost their best friend, barely 24 years old, to a rare form of childhood leukemia sparked by toxic plumes in the groundwater from hazardous waste that had been buried for decades, over decades of time, in the soil at Otis Air Force Base, rather than having been safely disposed of. They were trying to make sense of how this could be. You could almost hear their one clear mind, the one that believed their environment was safe, the one that believed that it was being cared for by the adults in charge. You could almost feel that one clear mind cracking under the weight of all the truth to the contrary. I heard strains of conversation, sometimes laughter, far more often tears, rising up the stairs from this mix of young men and women who came together to witness an unbearable truth, that a young person's life was extinguished before he lived it because of our collective carelessness, our reckless denial of our own toxic reality. I mean, nobody bothers to deny our crimes here in the US. We just don't even speak of them as crimes. When we discuss genocide, enslavement, dispossession, and their legacies, it's as if no one actually did these things. There's no one to account for them. When John Doe harmed the community of black students at my college, the community of white students demonstrated a near-perfect ability to reconstruct his act as just a costume, just trying to honestly represent an actual person, Celtics player Paul Pierce. They just stripped away the parts they didn't want to know, the parts they could have only come to know through an authentic witnessing of Jamie's truth, unencumbered by their own resistance or even their response, just affirming her truth, witnessing her suffering, and acting with her to alleviate it. Mashpee, we're down a brass tacks here. We're at ground zero of a healthy society. We're just trying to acknowledge that reality is real. Just think, we used to talk about climate change. Then we shifted to climate catastrophe to account for the urgency. But oh my goodness, if you look at the headlines today, environmentally minded people have now identified the movement for climate reality. Reality, Mashpee. That is the low bar of what we're fighting for. Just the ability to look at an apple and agree that it's an apple. The shared acknowledgement of the reality we're living and breathing each and every day. What we are looking for is collective awareness, collective accountability, collective healing. And that can only happen when individuals start seeing one another, recognizing experiences other than our own as legitimate, recognizing and admitting that they happened, witnessing and affirming new perspectives, working together to alleviate the suffering that we all share, though the degrees of our suffering, much to our collective shame, vary widely. Don't believe everything you think, Mashpee. Dare to be true. Your eyes will be awestruck at the green new worlds that suddenly appear. Thank you.